welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. North Korea has stepped up its weapons demonstrations in response to the large-scale U.S.-South Korea military exercises. Today, we assess North Korea's weapons capabilities and the alliance's overwhelming deterrence forces.
최근 북한에 고도화되는 SLBM 등 수중 위협에 대한 한미일의 대응 능력을 향상시키기 위해서 마련되었습니다.
Continue to monitor testing and activities of the DPRK, but our end goal here is the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
In the studio with me, Mr. Vann Van Diepen, former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Non-Proliferation. Mr. Van Diepen was the National Intelligence Officer for Weapons of Mass Destruction and Proliferation in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Also joining us, Colonel David Maxwell, the Vice President of the Center for Asia-Pacific Strategy. Colonel Maxwell was a former military planner for the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command. Welcome to the program.
Nice to be here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Now, Colonel Maxwell, North Korea unveiled a series of new weapons in great detail, including serial number. Now, there was a tactical nuclear warhead Hwasan-31, underwater drone, which is 해일, and then cruise missiles Hwasal-1 and 2. What is the biggest takeaway from North Korea's revelation in such great detail?
Yes, I think that they are really continuing to execute what I call their political warfare strategy to subvert South Korea and divide the ROK-U.S. alliance, their blackmail diplomacy strategy to coerce the ROK and U.S. into giving political and economic concessions, and then the development of advanced military capabilities. And all three of these efforts are really mutually supporting and reinforcing. And so what we're seeing is the development of these capabilities that do focus on warfighting, but also support these other lines of effort. Well, I think what is clear from all of this is that Kim Jong-un is really telling us that he has no intention of giving up his nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mr. Van Diepen, what do you make of the underwater drone 해일? North Korea says it can create nuclear tsunami to destroy enemies' ports and groups of warships, and it can stay underwater for 59 hours. Now, Russia has a nuclear-armed, nuclear-powered Poseidon. Is North Korea among the few countries in the world that has developed underwater drone, and is North Korea on par with Russia in this area?
North Korea is not on par with Russia. The Poseidon, the Russian vehicle, is, as you said, nuclear-powered, capable of high-speed, intercontinental range, deep diving, and has probably a 2-megaton nuclear warhead on it. The HAIL is really sort of an enlarged torpedo with a small nuclear warhead on it. It's slow, it's limited to theater range, and probably has something like a 10-kiloton warhead. But actually, neither of the vehicle's warheads could literally create a nuclear tsunami. Really what one of these weapons would do is sort of drench its target in radioactive seawater. I mean, it will still damage a target clearly, but the vision that they're trying to create of this tsunami is really something for political effect rather than its actual capability.
So North Korea is exaggerating.
At that point, but so is Russia. But North Korea clearly is trying to make people think they have something like the Poseidon when in fact it's much less capable. So they're clearly trying to send political messages.
Does North Korea's 해일 make military sense?
I don't believe so in the sense that it's slow. It's potentially vulnerable during its long transit time to target to being engaged by anti-submarine warfare forces. It's limited to coastal targets in the theater, and it's a nuclear weapon of that size is not as destructive when it's underwater because the water contains much of the force of the blast compared to an equivalent air burst such as that with North Korea's ballistic missiles, which are much larger and more capable.
Now, Colonel Maxwell, U.S. and South Korea resumed amphibious landing exercises, Sangnyong, for the first time in 5 years. But North Korea's new weapons to airburst and then detonate in land and sea, doesn't that complicate U.S. ability to dispatch soldiers onto the Korean peninsula during contingency, especially given that North Korea claims to be able to contaminate ports and airfields?
Yes, any use of weapons of mass destruction complicates military operations. But that is why we train. We actually train our forces to be able to operate in these environments. And of course, we employ systems to defend against them. Ideally, we want our missile defense systems to be able to protect us from those. But it is a very real possibility that these will be used. But we plan to fight through the use of weapons of mass destruction. And we have many ways of doing that. And of course, amphibious landings can take place in many areas, and we can use deception as well as North Korea. So we plan to be able to deal with this threat, and the militaries of both South Korea and the United States train to be able to operate in these environments and to continue to conduct military operations.
Now, Mr. Van Diepen, North Korea's photo showed 8 different types of delivery systems for the tactical nuclear warhead Hwasan-31, which includes a short-range ballistic missile, the cruise missile, and then also the super-large artillery. Now, the evidence that North Korea is showing, does this show that North Korea has completed the miniaturization and lightweighting of its tactical nuclear weapons?
Well, I think all of those weapon systems have long been assessed to be nuclear capable. And the warhead of the size that North Korea showed us in those photographs is something that's been judged to be within their capabilities and within the capabilities demonstrated by the nuclear testing that they've done so far. So there's been some strain in the outside commentating community that's been skeptical of North Korea's ability to do tactical nuclear warheads, and presumably these photographs help address that. But I think the main line of analysis, both inside and outside the government, has been that what we've seen is well within the capabilities that North Korea has been demonstrating over the past couple decades, really.
So North Korea has completed its miniaturization and lightweighting?
Not necessarily. We don't know how heavy that warhead is, but again, people seem to have this idea that nuclear warheads are these gigantic things that we saw in World War II. But any weapons missile system that can carry a 500-kilogram payload to a range of at least 300 kilometers is inherently capable of carrying a sort of first-generation proliferator's nuclear weapon. And all the North Korean missiles that we've seen demonstrated thus far, fit those parameters. And so it's not surprising at all that they would be nuclear capable. And indeed, with the Scuds and Nodongs and the first generation North Korean missiles, those have always been judged to be nuclear capable.
Colonel Maxwell, how does North Korea's new weapon systems tie into its war strategy? Is North Korea indicating that it will strike South Korea with nuclear weapons?
I think it's very clear that is what their strategy is. And in fact, when we look at how they would have to attack South Korea and win a war, there's really 4 things that they have to do in order to defeat the ROK-US alliance. Of course, number 1 is to defeat the air power. So they will strike air bases throughout the breadth and depth of South Korea. The second is to interrupt and really try to prevent ROK mobilization of all its military forces. The third will be prevent U.S. reinforcements of the peninsula. That's why ports and airfields are also important. And then the last is that they have to rapidly occupy the entire peninsula before mobilization and reinforcements can come in. So those are the 4 things. And of course, weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons can be very useful in destroying a lot of facilities. But those fixed facilities that they are going to attack in the initial part of the war, they are not critical for the defense of South Korea. because those are fixed locations, and the militaries will operate from many different locations, more locations than North Korea can attack. But clearly, they are developing capabilities to be able to attack the South Korean and U.S. military forces on the peninsula in support of their campaign plan to try to unify the peninsula by force.
Now, Mr. Van Diepen, North Korea's Hwasan-31 appeared to be 40 to 50 centimeters in diameter. In 2017, during the sixth nuclear test, Kim Jong-un took a photo with North Korea's miniaturized warhead, which is 60 centimeters in diameter. Now, North Korea didn't conduct any nuclear tests since. How did North Korea miniaturize the warhead?
Well, again, for the types of sort of standard fission warheads we're talking about here, it's long been assessed that, frankly, one doesn't need nuclear testing at all to develop that kind of system. You know, this sort of technology is really now 1940s technology. It's well understood. We also, don't know what kind of expertise North Korea could have gotten access from other sources, China, Russia. But it's not surprising that they would be able to develop this type of nuclear weapon in that size based on the amount of nuclear testing they've done. And frankly, they wouldn't necessarily had to have conducted any nuclear testing at all.
In other words, North Korea can further sophisticate its nuclear weapons without conducting any further nuclear tests.
Within limits. Again, if they want to go for very low yield, they probably need to conduct further nuclear testing. If they want to go for very high yield, they may well have to conduct further nuclear testing. But to continue to build sort of standard fission warheads with the sort of yields that we seem to be seeing right now, both in their testing and in the assessed yield of the warhead that they displayed, they really don't need to have further nuclear testing for its development. Now, there are a lot of good reasons to conduct further nuclear testing. You'd want to make sure that it's absolutely reliable, that it's reliable under operational conditions. There are a lot of good operational reasons to do it, but overwhelmingly, North Korea is almost certainly making these decisions based on political grounds. And that's really what's going to decide when, how, and what they do when it comes to nuclear testing, frankly, just like it does with missiles.
So we need to pay more attention to the 7th and the 8th and the 9th nuclear tests, when, how, and what?
Well, if they occur. How long have we been waiting for the next nuclear test? In my old job, it was standard. You'd always say they could conduct another nuclear test at any time. And indeed they can, but for whatever reason, thus far they haven't.
Now, Colonel Maxwell, South Korea's Joint Chief of Staff said North Korea may have exaggerated or fabricated its underwater drone capability, which Mr. Van Diepen explained to us in advance. Joint Chief of Staff also said that as for the integrated nuclear weapons management system, a nuclear trigger, a weapon is perfected when a test succeeds in a realistic field environment. Nothing of that nature has been confirmed yet. Is South Korea's stance to tone down North Korean capabilities, is it realistic and is it practical? Or is it dangerous in a sense that, as we just talked about, North Korea can sophisticate its capabilities without conducting any real-time tests?
Well, I think the chairman, the ROC chairman of the Joint Chiefs, is giving his best assessment and judgment that he can, based on the intelligence analysis and military professionals. I think he is trying to be as transparent as possible, both for policymakers and the public. And I think what is really important that he's saying is we shouldn't overestimate North Korean capabilities and exaggerate them. But on the other hand, we shouldn't underestimate them as well. North Korea has surprised us in the past and showed us things that we did not think were ready, missiles that have launched. And so they have showed us and done things that have surprised us. But I think it's really important not to overestimate or exaggerate their capabilities or underestimate them.
And Colonel Maxwell, military planners should assume that these weapons are operational. Now that North Korea has introduced a slew of new weapons, do you think U.S.'s posture to defend South Korea should be strengthened further?
Yes, I think as Sun Tzu said, never assume the enemy will not attack. Make yourself invincible. And I think that our defenses are sufficient at the current time. I think that this is why we train and why we are aggressively training to be able to defend against all these capabilities. But that said, we are going to continue to innovate. We conduct research and development. We look at lessons learned from other conflicts, particularly Putin's war in Ukraine. We also try to assess how North Korea might be learning from Putin's war in Ukraine as well. So we will continue to improve our defenses. But currently, as we currently stand, we are prepared to defend against South Korea, and any attack by North Korea will be repelled. And of course, any use of weapons of mass destruction will result in the end of the Kim family regime.
Now, Mr. Van Diepen, North Korea is showing that it can detonate nuclear warheads land, sea, and air. It is sophisticating its nuclear capability and delivery system capability. Given this fact, do you think the U.S. extended deterrence to South Korea should be strengthened and further tailored to this situation?
Well, again, as the Colonel said, I don't think we should be overestimating what's going on here. First of all, the real pacing factor is going to be what's the size of the North Korean nuclear weapons stockpile. They've got all these different delivery systems. They're going to have to decide how to use those nuclear warheads with those systems. They've got ICBMs, IRBMs, MRBMs, short-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. Now this, HAIL, assuming it becomes a deployable weapon system, they're going to have to decide how many of a relatively limited number of nuclear warheads they can devote to each of those. Plus, for the short-range systems, they have very important conventional warfighting missions. So it's not clear just how many nuclear weapons are going to actually end up being mounted on all these different options that the North Koreans have given themselves. And again, North Korea has probably had nuclear weapons deployed since the mid-1990s. Probably the first thing they were deployed on were short-range ballistic missiles. So this isn't a new threat that we're facing. We have a very robust military capability as an alliance. We have both conventional and nuclear superiority. North Korea is not in a position to challenge either of those. So I don't think there's any reason to sort of panic based on what the North Koreans are unveiling right now. And frankly, the only people that does any good for is the North Koreans.
But the United States takes very seriously about threats against the U.S. mainland and also thinks about the worst case scenarios. But in this case, North Korea is stepping up its threat against South Korea, which is allied to the United States. And wouldn't the United States also think about the worst case scenarios and don't just assume that we are overestimating it?
Well, certainly we are going to be prudent military planners. But the North Koreans also have to be prudent military planners. And they, again, know they're facing a conventionally superior foe with many times more nuclear weapons. And so, we're not the only ones who have to temper what we do and how we do it based on the capabilities of the other side. And we've got, long experience in doing this kind of thing. We survived and arguably won the Cold War facing a foe who had conventional nuclear superiority over us and had nuclear parity with us. And so if we can successfully deal with that threat for decades, there's every reason to believe that we can continue to successfully deter North Korea. That said, we have to keep doing our homework and doing the kind of work that the Colonel has talked about, the command's doing, improving our tactics, improving our technology. But on the assumption that's going to continue going on, we should be very confident about our ability to continue to be able to deter North Korea.
I want both your opinion on this. South Korean scholars say that there needs to be offset strategy to offset North Korea's nuclear capability. Do you think it is time that U.S. should consider redeploying tactical nuclear weapons to South Korea?
Frankly, I don't think that is necessary. However, I strongly respect South Korea, the discussion about developing their own and redeploying tactical nuclear weapons, because what that says to me is that South Korea is absolutely committed to its defense and is looking at every option to defend itself against the North. Now, that said, North Korea very much likes the friction that is created by these discussions because one of their main focuses is to drive a wedge in the ROK-US alliance. And so we should not allow that to happen. We should continue our extended deterrence discussions, our planning, and our commitment. And we should determine what is necessary from a military perspective, whether to redeploy tactical nuclear weapons. I think the military commanders will give their best advice to the presidents both countries on whether to do that or not, but we should not allow the discussion to support North Korea's political warfare strategy to unhinge the alliance. And again, we should respect the fact that South Korea is absolutely committed to the defense of the ROC, as is the United States.
So, Mr. Van Diepen, Colonel Maxwell just said that he respects how South Korea is out to defend its own country. What is your take? Do you think the tactical nuclear weapons should be deployed to South Korea at this point?
I mean, from a military operational standpoint, it's really not necessary. You know, the United States has plenty of means safely based off peninsula to deliver nuclear warheads against the North Korean military. By deploying tactical nuclear warheads in South Korea, we just create operational problems for ourselves. We have to secure those weapons. We have to change how we operate. They're vulnerable to attack by North Korean weapons where they would be safely secure otherwise, either in the United States or at sea in submarines or ships. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. But deterrence has a big political component, as the Colonel has alluded to. And it's good that the two sides are talking about this issue and talking about how to address it. And if at the end of the day they decide to bolster the political part of deterrence by reintroducing those weapons, you know, by definition, if that is what it takes to reassure our South Korean allies, it's worth considering. But we need to be clear that it really does not have a real military justification.
Now, Colonel Maxwell, in February, there was Deterrence Strategy Committee tabletop exercises, and what they really focused on was more joint planning and execution. Do you envision NATO-like nuclear joint planning coming soon between U.S. and RK?
Well, I hate to make comparisons. I think, you know, there's a lot of apples and oranges between the NATO alliance, the ROC-US alliance. What I believe is that we are going to keep evolving our extended deterrence in the right way that makes sense for the ROC-US alliance. And I think, again, we are demonstrating that we are absolutely committed to extended deterrence in the defense of South Korea. And as I said, you know, previously, South Korea is strongly committed, absolutely committed to its own defense. And I think that the allies working together will enhance extended deterrence in a way that makes sense for South Korea and for the ROC-US alliance. And it may or may not be similar to NATO. We got to do what makes sense for this alliance.
And it's also important to point out that a big part of extended deterrence is not nuclear. The conventional capabilities that we have and continue to develop are also a critical part of this.
Now, Colonel Maxwell, North Korea had the slogan of 우리 민족끼리, which means amongst only our Korean people, and previously implied that it is targeting United States with its nuclear weapons. Now, it is evident that North Korea is now targeting South Korea with its weapons. So those people who thought that North Korea will only use its nuclear weapon against the United States, were they naive or were they deceived by North Korea?
Well, I think that an understanding of the nature of the Kim family regime and its objectives and its strategy leads to the realization that North Korea is going to use all its capabilities to achieve its objectives. And unfortunately, that includes attacking South Korea. In fact, most importantly, includes attacking South Korea. And so I think that while it was wishful thinking to believe that North Korea would not use nuclear weapons against South Korea, I don't believe that was ever their intent, and really was a part of their political warfare strategy to subvert South Korea, to create that kind of feeling that North and South were actually more allied against the United States and other countries. And I think that the people who believe that, yes, they were subject to North Korea's deception, but you know, I think that we are well past that now, and there should be a clear understanding. As President Yoon said, North Korea is a hostile enemy, and that recognition needs to be clear throughout the South Korean public.
You know, and that contention was also just inconsistent with the capabilities North Korea actually had. It didn't even have the ability to reach the U.S. homeland until 2017. So for all those years, the only targets they could reach were basically in South Korea and Japan. And the idea that you could attack only the U.S. in South Korea with a nuclear weapon, you know, clearly there would be huge collateral damage on the Korean population if North Korea used nuclear weapons against, quote, the U.S., unquote, in South Korea.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Colonel Maxwell, Mr. Van Diepen, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.